Ladies and gentlemen, again, let me apologize for the time constraints, but I have been looking forward to this panel since we have been putting this summit together, and I thought it would be just a good idea for us to be able to share some of the experiences with the international community. And I've had the pleasure to basically talk about what we want to say here with my colleagues at your embassy, Your Excellency. We have talked extensively about this. Ambassador of Singapore, we meet all the time, and our conversations are always open. And I know it's always ladies first, but today what we're going to start with is number 2 on the Global Competitiveness Index of the World Economic Forum, and that is Singapore. Your Excellency, we had a very interesting couple of panels yesterday and presentations to talk about the challenges that Egypt is facing in terms of competitiveness. We talked about how we can bring down the ranking from 116, which we believe is not the position Egypt should be on in the World Economic Forum Global Competitiveness Index. We have set a private sector-led initiative that by 2016-2017 report of the WEF on competitiveness to come down to the ranking of 19. I think it is achievable. I think it is attainable. But you're with us here today, Your Excellency, to share with us the experiences that make Singapore absolutely so competitive in the world, number 2 after Switzerland. What is it? How did you do it? And what can we learn from these experiences? Please.
Testing. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Let me start by thanking Mr. Ashraf Naguib as well as the organizers for inviting me to be part of this distinguished summit. In response to your question, Ashraf, I mean, in the case of Singapore, when we started out in 1965, we had 0 resources. I mean, essentially we had a very clean slate. So we came to the conclusion that the only way that we are going to be relevant to the rest of the world is to plug ourselves to the big markets. So we started off in 1965 focusing on building Singapore into a hub. And I say this because I can see similar kind of thinking that is taking place in Egypt. Earlier all of you all have listened to Dr. Ahmed Darwish. He said that there's 461 square kilometers of land in the Suez Canal. But I think the most important thing is, in the case of Singapore, we had a group of leaders who had a long-term vision. They wanted to make Singapore into not just a civil aviation hub. They wanted it to be a logistics hub, a transportation hub, a business hub. So essentially to become relevant to the rest of the world. The basic principle for us in Singapore is if we disappear tomorrow, no one is going to weep for us. So in other words, you have to make yourself relevant to the rest of the world. And just some quick statistics to tell you how we have become relevant to the world. All our key partners are US, Europe, China, Japan, India. Everyone is represented in Singapore. So in other words, we can describe ourselves as we are non-ideological, pragmatic, completely focused on economic development. And we try to separate business from politics at all. I mean, essentially we do not try and mix it, and that is our basic premise. When you start mixing politics and business, it makes it very, very difficult for the businesses to thrive. And my final point before I stop is that ultimately it's all about confidence. And the confidence comes from many different sources. The first, it comes from a predictable environment where all the businesses in Singapore, the foreign businesses in particular, they feel that the rules and the procedures are open, transparent, and fair to all. The moment there is a perception of injustice, you know that that rocks the foundation of the way that we run business. So today we have 15,000 multinational corporations in Singapore, and none of them are dominant. You have the Europeans are huge investors in Singapore. They have used Singapore as a hub for their operations in Asia. The American Fortune 500 companies, we have 319 out of 500 top American companies operating out of Singapore to serve their products in Asia. We have 4,000 Chinese companies and 3,500 Indian companies. So you can see from this composition that we are not reliant on any one economic engine. Ultimately, our whole policies are worked on the basis of fair and free competition between the domestic companies as well as the foreign companies, and it's an entire ecosystem that we are building. Today, we are going through some difficult period in Singapore. As a result of China's economic slowdown, of course, there will be some impact on Singapore because we are, you will never find a country that is so trade dependent like Singapore. 400% trade represents 400% of our GDP. So in other words, when global trade shrinks, or when any of these 5 major partners, US, EU, Japan, India, and China, when they have problems and they sneeze, in Singapore we all get a cold. Okay, so for us this is, but essentially we will cushion ourselves. There is a buffer for us because when one engine slows down, we have the other 4 engines that is still humming. So the most important thing is to have a very well diversified economic base. Thank you.
Your Excellency, if you'll allow me to stay with you for a second on that note that you specified, keeping business away from politics. Now, Singapore is a very, very small country in comparison to Egypt. Do you think that we would be able to make that differentiation? That's something that we've suffered from in the past. Usually businessmen become ministers become members of parliament. I mean, we haven't been able to make that differentiation or that separation yet. How was it done in Singapore? Is it a matter of regulations, policies? Is it a constitutional aspect? I mean, how have you approached that separation?
Thank you. Very good question. When we first became independent, it was during the Cold War period in Singapore. Our whole region was going through a Cold War period. But a group of wise leaders from Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Brunei, they decided that they were war-weary. In other words, they became very tired of conflict and so on that was going on in the region. So these 5 leaders came together and they decided to form an ASEAN. Think of ASEAN as, in Africa there is SADC, there is COMESA, in the Gulf countries there is a GCC. All these leaders came together, they felt that the way we are going to succeed is through economic development. Don't try and bring our bilateral differences into the regional dimension. And all these 5 leaders, today we are 10 ASEAN countries. At that time, from 1967 until 2000, these 5 leaders made sure, I mean, we had so many problems. Singapore had problems with Malaysia, with Indonesia, we had a lot of conflict. But the leaders resolved that these conflicts would be kept in the bilateral and not be mashed up in the regional setting. If we can work on economic development, let's focus on that. Today, Singapore and Malaysia, we are number 1 in terms of trading relationship. So in other words, we are dependent on them for a market, they are dependent on us for investments and trade and so on. So it becomes a very mutually beneficial relationship. I'll give you another example of a region that hasn't quite succeeded, South Asia. This is what I'm talking about is Southeast Asia. South Asia are countries that include India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and so on. It's still growing at 4%, 5% generally, but their politics there, it's so domineering that it's very difficult for them to work on any regional economic arrangement. So till today, they have not succeeded. Everything is based on a bilateral relationship between India, Pakistan, so on. But in Southeast Asia, we have had a head start from 1967. Today, last 31st December 2015, we have now come up with an ASEAN Economic Community. Not like the European Union, but 60 to 70% close to the European Union. Key difference is we don't believe that the European Union is our model. Okay, we don't want to be a currency union, we don't want to be a monetary union, because we have many differences amongst ourselves. So we decided we will focus on economic integration, but monetary union, political union, this is not something that we are ready for. And if you look at the European experience today, I think many European countries have different views of what integration really means. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. So, not to make the mistakes that the Europeans have made in the past couple of decades, I think. Or, as a matter of fact, if we learn from history, they shouldn't have done it, coming back to the Roman Empire and the Londinium and the actually unified currency that they had during the Roman Empire, and that failed miserably as well. But that brings me to Ambassador Cardell. It's such a pleasure to have you here, honestly, and I'm going to build off what His Excellency just said. Denmark is a small country as well, a very large economy, but it is in the midst of this recession, this major issues that is happening in the European Union, in addition to the fact, as His Excellency referred, that some people might be changing their minds, some people are rethinking the whole idea. How do you remain competitive in under such harsh economic environment since at least 2008 in Europe? What has Denmark been doing so well to be one of the top 20? I believe you're 16 or 19 on the competitiveness index. So what makes you one of the top 20 countries despite the hardship that Europe has been going through under the European Union for the past decade, please?
Thank you so much, and Ashraf, thank you so much for the invitation and for the opportunity to be here today and to share to the extent that I can what the Danish experience can offer in a context of what Egypt is going through. As you say, the Danish economy is to a great extent, and the Danish society to a great extent is of course affected very much by the surroundings of where we are, but also is doing fairly well. We have our challenges, etc., and I'll get back to that happily so. But yes, there are some things where you stop up and say, so what went right? And then you look at the challenges. And I think a big part of it is, again, also is what was alluded to this morning and what Ambassador Prem was alluding to too. Some of this takes time, and some of this takes direction, some of this takes leadership. Some of this takes a certain sense of national consensus too. Even if you have your internal discussions, a certain sense of national consensus of direction, because there are many, many choices that have to be made in this, and you can't just change course every time there is, a new minister, a new government, a new election. There has to be an overall framework of direction. There also has to be a certain level of transparency. There has to be a recognition of humbleness, that none of us, where we are talking about the long-term perspective, none of us can see exactly all of what it takes. So we have to be ready to stop up and reflect and say, well, I was wrong, and without that leading to a lot of unfortunate situations. But if you look at what has happened in Denmark, I think there was have to go back. You go back to the 60s, I go back to the 70s when I set the building blocks of where we are today. The energy crisis in the 70s was really a wake-up call for my little country. The Danish economy was an agricultural economy that if it wasn't agriculture, it was agribusiness to a great extent. We had no energy resources, we had ourselves, we enjoyed our close little society, and all of a sudden we woke up to a day where it just couldn't be that way. And that led to a lot of discussions about how would we had our welfare state, but we knew we wouldn't be able to afford it in the long run unless our economy continued to grow. So what would we have to do in order to make sure that the future for the little country was one of prosperity rather than one of crisis and limitations? And there are many things that you can highlight. What I would like to do is to highlight the 5 areas where I believe that Denmark has kind of stood out. That doesn't mean that these 5 areas alone would be what it takes, but basically to say that these are the 5 areas where we would have had an edge. I think the first and foremost, one of the things that is unique about Denmark is what we